On the 19th of June 2022, Colombia elected its first left-wing president in the country's history. While the historical significance of this decision is yet to be seen, it is no doubt the result of an increasingly dissatisfied Colombian working class who remains shockingly poor despite the average work week being 6 days long. And what does those 6 days of hard work earn you? A meager minimum wage of $250 a month, resulting in 40% of the country's population living below the poverty line. But this meager minimum wage isn't because Colombia is a poor country. The situation is in fact quite the opposite. Colombia, like many South American countries, have access to vast amounts of natural resources, including oil, and has the world's 31st highest GDP. There is just one small problem with that. All this wealth is hoarded by the country's small, predominantly European and Arab elite that has dominated Colombia ever since its colonial period, thanks to a racial caste system in which Europeans were on the top, mestizos in the middle, and blacks and Native Americans at the bottom. And while the country might have parted ways with the Spanish Empire, the European elite kept their stranglehold over the predominantly mestizo country. This has compounded into Colombia becoming one of the world's most unequal countries, where the 10% richest own more than 50% of the wealth, while the primarily black and mestizo working class only owns 10% of the country's wealth. This staggering and criminal inequality that is on display everywhere in this beautiful country has resulted in Colombia going through several major periods of severe unrest and crime, first starting in 1948 when Jorge Gaitan, a popular and moderately left-wing politician who wanted to implement economic democracy in Colombia and finally wrestle power away from the Colombian kleptocracy, was murdered by a mentally unstable man whose motives and possible backers remain unknown to this day, since he himself was also brutally murdered right afterwards by an angry crowd. This murder was, however, just the straw that broke the camel's back, but nonetheless it was the final straw and resulted in Bogotá exploding into 10 hours of anarchic violence, today known as El Bogotazo, that left much of downtown Bogotá damaged and up to 3,000 people dead. El Bogotazo also marked the start of La Violencia, the violence, a period of Colombian history where the Conservative Party and its militias, who wanted to preserve the status quo, fought against the left-wing Liberal Party and their own militias. Despite La Violencia being an incredibly brutal conflict, especially for the rural areas where both sides committed horrific atrocities, resulting in up to 2% of the country's population dying, that being around 200,000 people, La Violencia ended in 1958 in a stalemate, with the country's kleptocratic elite continuing to dominate the country's politics. But the more radical left-wing groups like the Colombian Communist Party and other left-wing organizations refused this outcome and continued fighting against the government. And this came just as the Cold War between the capitalist West and the communist East was heating up. Therefore, the armed wing of the Communist Party of Colombia, known as Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarios de Colombia, or FARC, among other groups, received funding from the Soviet bloc, and the Colombian government, for its own survival, therefore moved further towards the United States, thus practically becoming nothing more than a client state of Washington, D.C. In return for this continued American military support that constituted a lifeline for the Colombian elite, American companies were allowed to access the Colombian elite's most treasured natural resource, the poor and somewhat non-threatening Colombian working class that they had already been exploiting for every penny for hundreds of years, first through the already mentioned racial caste system, and now via the capitalist and consumerist wage slavery scheme. And when Colombian workers tried to organize against their domestic and foreign oppressors, these oppressors employed paramilitary groups connected to right-wing politicians and narcos to murder union activists. American companies accused of supporting such paramilitary groups includes Chiquita, whose bananas I'm sure we have all eaten at some point without ever knowing about this possible connection to thugs for hire. The Colombian army also became famous for randomly executing farmers and claiming they were guerrillas in so-called Falsos Positivos, since they were paid for every enemy fighter they killed, thus essentially turning their own countrymen into meal coupons. On the other hand, the left-wing fighters who had embarked on a guerrilla campaign Spain were no saints either. The leftist fighters were followers of the Cuban Revolution, and therefore they tried to replicate its strategy called the Foucault theory. Foucault theory believed that by tying down government resources in a guerrilla war, it would make the government vulnerable to collapsing from a communist revolution. Just one small problem here. It requires a government to be extremely incompetent, like Batista's government was in Cuba, but thanks to American support, the Colombian government wasn't going anywhere. Prior to the invasion of Iraq, the Colombian government was in fact the third largest recipient of US military aid, only behind Egypt and Israel. Therefore, the guerrilla strategy spectacularly failed, something they, however, refused to accept. So to sustain this seemingly hopeless war, they needed a steady and large cash flow, which they, thanks to Western drug habits, got via the lucrative cocaine trade that politicians and drug cartels were already reaping the benefits of. Drug trafficking turned the war in Colombia away from being a political struggle into something more closely resembling a turf war over territory, with different leftist groups frequently even fighting each other over coca plantations and trafficking routes. And with no end in sight for the conflict, the leftists who rose up to overthrow a kleptocracy that kept the population in a cycle of poverty suddenly had become part of the problem by continuing to contribute to a never-ending war that keeps their own farmers and working class in a cycle of poverty and their own country unsafe and dysfunctional. This situation was only improved when Alvaro Uribe, a man who came from an incredibly rich background, became president of Colombia and managed to deal crippling blows to left-wing guerrillas, thus noticeably improving the security situation in the country for the average Colombian, and making Uribe a hugely influential figure in Colombian politics to this day. However, Uribe is also exactly the type of person that made Colombians want to overthrow their government in the first place. Under Alvaro Uribe, the economic inequality stayed the same. Gated communities has sprung up everywhere. The amazing flora and fauna of Colombia, including the Amazon, has continued to become more and more damaged. And lastly, workers have lost even more rights, with the work week being extended to 6 days a week under his rule. And naturally, since he was the former mayor of Medellin during the reign of Pablo Escobar, Alvaro Uribe has been implicated in loads of corruption and political assassinations, among much more. And this is all according to a newly declassified 1991 report by the US Defense Intelligence that described Uribe, the Bush administration's most steadfast ally in Latin America, as a close personal friend of Pablo Escobar and as dedicated to collaboration with the Medellin drug cartel. Naturally, this all happened at the height of the drug war, when the United States was jailing hordes of its own poor for trafficking the Colombian cocaine every single year, while Uribe is still free as a bird till this day. But despite that, Uribe also managed to do just enough in terms of improving the country's security that it firmly placed him and his pro-American and pro-elite candidates at the center of Colombian power until this election, when Gustavo Petro, a controversial left-wing figure from the Socialist Party Polo, was elected. But why did the Colombian population for the first time ever vote for a self-described socialist? Well, as already mentioned, a large part of this is that 40% of the Colombian population is still living in poverty with no real hopes of escaping, since the minimum wage only provides just enough to sustain oneself, a situation I am sure many of my viewers are already too familiar with. And normal Colombians' only real hope of escaping this cycle of poverty is either immigrating, selling one's own body and soul, participating in the narcotics trade, or lastly, and most commonly, having connections within the nepotistic Colombian administration, something most Colombians sorely lack. This unfortunate predicament was only made worse when President Iván Duque locked down the entire country in response to the COVID pandemic. This decision especially affected the already poor Colombians who have little to no social and economic safety net, and who frequently also rely on tourism and self-employment to make a living. These were the people who were sent even further into poverty, with extreme urban poverty tripling to affect 12% of the population. This frustration and desperation then exploded into massive protests and riots in 2021, when the already incredibly unpopular president Iván Duque proposed a new tone-deaf tax reform that would likely propel even more Colombians further into poverty and starvation. These protests were brutally and violently suppressed by the government, who even brazenly allowed the same armed right-wing militias as previously mentioned to open fire on protesters with handguns, while the police simply just stood by and did nothing.
Mírenlo ahí, mírenlo, es que mírenlo, mírenlo. Míralo, míralo cómo viene hacia acá, míralo cómo viene hacia acá. Míralo, míralo. ¡Nos están amenazando! ¡Nos están amenazando! Va la gente, va la gente. Está disparando a la gente. Vea, vea la gente. Vea la gente. Están viendo, lo están viendo todos en vivo. Vea. Corran, protéjanse. Para atrás.
Ahí los pueden ver, esos están disparando esos hombres. Ahí los tienen. Disparándole a los muchachos con la policía ahí al lado. La policía ahí detrás. Y les disparan a los muchachos. Mira, hijo. Señora agente de prensa de Estados Unidos. ¿Quiénes son esos civiles ahí? Ahí podemos ver a los...
Many protesters were therefore murdered on the streets, like Lucas Villa, a peaceful and dancing protester who was brutally murdered in a drive-by shooting, but who then became a symbol of the protest movement. So to summarize, the continued failure to address political violence, corruption, robbery epidemics, poverty, and inequality by a political elite living on another planet whose basic salary is 40 times the minimum wage has created a perfect storm that has allowed for Gustavo Petro to become elected as president of Colombia with the highest number of Colombian votes in history on a social democratic and patriotic anti-American platform, stating in his victory speech that real change is coming. Gustavo Petro is also an interesting candidate because he is a former member of the left-wing guerrilla group M19, which is used by his political opponents to attack him by calling him guerrillero, and also by Western newspapers to generate clicks by writing "former guerrilla becomes president of Colombia." But in fact, Petro was never a guerrilla, but more of a community activist working on the group's behalf. Others find it refreshing to see a working-class man who was politically active throughout his youth finally becoming president instead of just another trust fund baby. Now, apart from that, here are some other reasons why Gustavo Petro being the president of Colombia is very interesting. Firstly, the election of Gustavo Petro is likely to strike yet another blow against American hegemony in Latin America, with the United States now having lost both Bolivia, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and potentially also Colombia as client states. And all of these states have instead turned towards Russia and China as strategic partners, both out of necessity and because of their historical ties to revolutionary movements in South America. Secondly, because of this new government's potentially left-wing agenda, several communist guerrilla groups have now offered to restart peace talks. Thirdly, Gustavo Petro has promised to renew diplomatic ties with the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, who has been under crippling sanctions from the United States and Colombia since 2014 because of their independent foreign policy. If this happens, then this will likely strengthen Venezuela's economic situation and potentially make many Venezuelans return to Venezuela from Colombia, where a huge influx of poor Venezuelans has put pressure on social services in recent years. Fourthly, Gustavo Petro has promised to hugely improve the protection of the natives and the Amazon, a place where environmental activists are being killed by narcos and right-wing paramilitaries constantly. And lastly, but most importantly, Petro has promised to significantly improve the situation for the average Colombian by instituting a 5-day work week, nationalizing important industries, and finally reworking the healthcare system by dropping private middlemen. And while all this sounds absolutely amazing, many Colombians are still very skeptical of Petro. And this skepticism is in no way unfounded, because despite both Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia currently having left-wing governments, the situation for the average person in these countries has not changed significantly, and corruption rates have either stayed the same or worsened, because if there's one problem that Latin American states are known for, it is corruption, and one would be forgiven for thinking that the solution to this problem isn't just more state without actually addressing the root of the issue. And Gustavo Petro isn't the first Latin American president who has a background in genuine and well-meaning revolutionary activity. So did the neighboring country of Venezuela's presidents Nicolás Maduro and Hugo Chavez. Both of them came from ideological backgrounds where they risked it all to change their country. But despite that, both of them are today notorious for their many corruption scandals and general authoritarianism. But only time will tell how Gustavo Petro's presidency turns out. Will he finally put an end to Colombia's 200 years of elite rule? Will he become a moderate social democrat? Or will he become a tyrant using Marxist language to justify his own power grabs while the population remains in poverty like many socialist messiahs throughout history? Or maybe he won't be able to do anything at all since his political bloc doesn't even have a congressional majority. But to truly find out what normal Colombians think, we went onto the streets of a normal middle-class neighborhood in Bogotá the day after the election to interview people about their new president, Gustavo Petro, and the future of Colombia. These were the answers we got.
Señorita, ¿qué piensas sobre el nuevo presidente de Colombia? ¿Positivo o negativo?
Súper negativo.
¿Por qué, señorita? Dos palabras.
Decepción total.
Ok, gracias.
Vamos a quedar igual que Venezuela, peor.
Señorita, tengo una pregunta. ¿Qué piensas sobre el nuevo presidente de Colombia? ¿Positivo o negativo?
Positivo.
¿Por qué?
Porque es una persona que está dispuesta a mejorarle la calidad de vida al pueblo. No está enfocado solamente en que sigan bien los mismos de siempre.
¿Tienes más esperanza por el país en este momento?
Sí, no tanto por los privilegios que puedan tener algunos, sino que sea una igualdad.
Pues hay muchas personas como a la derecha aquí que siempre dicen, oh, vamos a tener un país como Venezuela. ¿Qué vas a decir a personas que dicen ese tipo de cosas?
Eso realmente es absurdo porque la situación actual del país no es muy diferente a la que está viviendo Venezuela actualmente. Entonces, creo que el presidente actual elegido, como es Gustavo Petro, ha hecho referencia en que desea desarrollar la economía desde el punto del agro y los campesinos, que son los que se han visto muy afectados. No ha hablado en llegar a regalar nada, sino en darle la oportunidad a la gente de que crezca por sí misma.
Señor, ¿qué piensa sobre el nuevo presidente de Colombia? ¿Positivo?
Muy bien. Pues hombre, es un tipo que conoce bien este país y tiene mucha experiencia.
Señor, ¿qué piensa sobre el nuevo presidente de Colombia? ¿Positivo o negativo?
Negativo.
Negativo. All right. Señorita.
Señora.
Sí.
Ya estoy vieja.
Ok, bueno, no te preocupes. ¿Qué piensas?
¿Del nuevo presidente?
Ajá, Gustavo Petro.
De Gustavo Petro, pues es la primera vez que tenemos un presidente de izquierda.
Sí.
Votamos por él, vamos a confiar en que sus políticas sean buenas, en que se mejore el tema de seguridad, que se mejore el tema de la brecha social que hay tan alta, tanto con mujeres como personas muy pobres. Y entonces estamos confiados en que todo va a salir adelante.
Sí.
Somos un país de avanzada, que nos recuperamos y avanzamos fácilmente.
Sí, Colombia es un país con muchos recursos, todo.
Digamos, de los limitantes que tenemos es el tema de la seguridad. Entonces, si avanzamos con todo el proceso de paz, podríamos dar a conocer al mundo esa biodiversidad y poder fortalecernos en el tema de turismo, abrir las puertas a más personas como tú que vienen a conocer nuestro lindo país. Venga, pregúntele a mi esposo que se está en contra.
¿Dónde está? ¿Él? Ok. Señor, ¿qué piensas sobre el nuevo presidente de Colombia, Gustavo Petro?
Con gran expectativa, esperando que todo lo que ha manifestado en los discursos y en su discurso de agradecimiento, que ojalá se cumpla, porque pues la verdad muchas cosas lo que promete, y si todo se cumple pues excelente, pero pues para todo eso se necesita recursos. ¿De dónde va a sacar los recursos?
Señor, ¿qué piensas sobre el nuevo presidente de Colombia? All right. we tried.
Para mí es muy negativo, es un retroceso para el país debido a las propuestas negativas que él presentó al país durante estos meses de campaña.
Entonces, ¿tienes miedo por el futuro de Colombia en este momento?
Sí, por supuesto. Va a acabar con la exploración del petróleo, es un retroceso. Cuando vean las colas que se hagan para surtir combustible, ahí es donde la gente va a empezar a lamentarse cuando empiece la escasez de los productos. Eso es un modelo venezolano y se lo digo porque él estuvo muchas veces en Venezuela con Chávez, incluso fue asesor económico de Chávez. Yo no sé si estoy equivocado, pero en 6 meses o en un año va a pasar lo mismo que está pasando hoy en Chile o en Perú. donde la gente está saliendo masivamente a protestar en contra de ese gobierno por las propuestas económicas.
Hay muchas personas que siempre dicen, oh, las personas que no apoyan Petro son ricos, etcétera, etcétera. ¿Tú eres rico o no?
Yo trabajo de domiciliario y me hago hasta 30 pesos diarios. O sea, él obtuvo la votación más alta fue por parte de la juventud, una juventud que desconoce de lo que realmente pasó durante aquellos años en el país, donde la gente no podía viajar incluso de acá a Medellín porque lo secuestraban.
Amigos, ¿qué piensas sobre el nuevo presidente de Colombia? ¿Positivo o negativo?
Positivo.
¿Positivo?
Positivo.
Sí. ¿Por qué?
Pues porque considero que este país realmente necesita un cambio y siento que ese presidente lo representa.
Sí. ¿Y cómo?
Con sus ideales. Pues, por ejemplo, sus propuestas piensa cambiar muchas cosas que vienen ocurriendo hace muchos años en este país. Y digamos que, vuelvo al punto, es el primer presidente de la izquierda.
Sí, entonces, por toda la historia de Colombia, ¿no?
Exacto.
Sí, esto es interesante, seguramente. Sí. Entonces, ¿tienes más esperanza por el país en este momento?
Sí, claro, en este momento, pues es que es un presidente que representa al pueblo realmente.
Sí.
Pues un salario mínimo acá vale $230, eso no es nada. Entonces el punto es que lo que buscamos pues con este nuevo cambio para Colombia es cerrar esa vaina que es como la desigualdad que tenemos acá y que realmente un salario acá valga.
Un próximo dictador.
Ok. ¿Por qué?
Negativo.
Negativo.
Sí.
Totalmente negativo.
Nosotros somos de Venezuela y
¿Pero viven aquí?
Sí, hace 7 años. Y vimos cómo sucedieron las cosas allá y están igual sucediendo acá. Entonces como que dan un poquito de miedo.
El mismo discurso, el mismo guión.
Un manual, pero pues esperamos que no sea así, que sea
Ojalá
diferente.
que no lo dejen.
En Venezuela empezó como así también.
Sí, obvio, ya lo endiosaron. Es que el problema no es él. El problema es el pueblo que lo endiosa y le va a permitir todo y ahí ya...
¿Pero qué dices entonces a las personas que, por ejemplo, dicen, pues estamos trabajando todos los días y no tenemos mucho, no hay mucha igualdad? Hay personas también que tienen este tipo de situaciones aquí en Colombia. Tenemos mucha pobreza también. ¿Qué quieren decir a estos tipos de personas? Porque estoy seguro hay muchas de ellos que también votan por Petro.
Digamos, es una consecuencia de lo que sucede ahora por todas esas políticas malas que han sucedido todo el tiempo, o sea, todo este tiempo atrás. También eso pasó allá, ¿sabes? Mucha corrupción, muchas cosas malas que hacen que suceda y salga alguien como un mesías a querer salvar al pueblo. Ojalá esas políticas que va a implementar sí ayuden a esa gente porque pues la gente apostó en él. Entonces lo importante es que no lo defraude. Entiendo a la gente que votó por él, por un cambio, porque están cansados de ver lo mismo siempre, pero ese cambio a veces puede salir peor de lo que estaba antes. Ojalá que no.
Ojalá que no,
Ojalá que
pero
no.
Pues vamos a ver.
Sí,
Entonces,
sí,
pero tienen miedo del futuro del país, seguramente. Sí.
¿Por votar por Petro o qué? Pues pensando que ojalá tenga palabra y cumpla lo que dijo, porque como la mayoría de presidentes son así, le prometen al pueblo, los ilusionan, como cuando usted ilusiona a un niño con un dulce, con un helado, y el pueblo se emociona por ir a votar, y cuando ya llegan al poder se hacen los malos y no cumplen, perdón la palabra, ¿no? Se hacen los pendejos y no cumplen y se hacen los hueones y ya subí al poder y como lo que les importa es llegar a la presidencia para ganar buen sueldo, segundo, buena pensión, porque una pensión de
cuando ellos tienen poder pueden...
Ya se olvidan del pueblo,
exactamente,
porque la pensión que les dan a ellos es una pensión de por vida, hasta que mueran. Si un congresista, esos que no era la paja ya, sino durmiendo en el Congreso y en el Senado, porque llegan a dormir, firman la entrada de... ¿La asistencia? La asistencia, firman la asistencia y... a dormir allá en el Congreso y en el Senado y sí cobran como 38, 40 millones de pesos mensuales. Entonces un presidente, un presidente debe ganar por ahí 50, 80 millones, yo creo. Y eso todo sale del bolsillo de los colombianos. El gobierno y en este país los tienen tan olvidados a nosotros como de pronto ciudadanos que son de la minoría, porque los habitantes de calle y los recicladores no somos todo el mundo. Y como somos minoría, no estamos como tenidos en cuenta mediante los programas o proyectos que hagan los gobiernos, eso los olvidan.
Pero con el nuevo presidente entonces tú tienes más esperanza.
Pues uno siempre tiene como la esperanza, ¿no?
Sí.
Yo cuando subió Duque, no sé ustedes con el antiguo. Claro, uno cuando sube el presidente de nuevo uno dice, uy, ojalá que uno sí lo tenga esta vez en cuenta, ojalá que esta vez sí se acuerden de nosotros y nos hagan algún proyecto para nosotros, ¿sí?
Sí, seguro.
Pero no, llegan allá al poder y se olvidan de uno, entonces uno ya se desilusiona.
And now finally, Personally, here is my own opinion. I personally doubt that either the left or the right will be able to truly transform Latin America into the paradise it could be. Instead, a completely new force is needed that emphasizes true transparency and direct democracy, which is the only way forward for a place like Latin America, where both the left-wing and the right-wing politicians have failed time and time again. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you liked the video, then remember to give the video a like and a nice comment, and also share it wherever you can. This video was less generically controversial than some of my other videos, but it was nonetheless a topic that I felt had never been properly explained. My upcoming videos will, however, cover topics that I am sure will stir up some emotions. The first one will cover the horrible and completely ignored Turkish colonization of Cyprus, where the Turks expelled the native Greek population from half of the island. The second one will debunk the Islamist myth that describes the Islamic kingdoms in Spain as a multicultural paradise, a narrative which was the furthest thing from the truth. And thirdly, the Arab slave trade, so look forward to those videos soon with a couple of smaller videos thrown in between. Lastly, I highly recommend supporting me on Patreon. I always post behind the scenes videos from both upcoming and recent projects, including full audio versions of my videos, sometimes week in advance of the full release, among much more. By supporting me on Patreon, you will also be credited at the end of all my videos, along with all the other amazing supporters who makes this channel possible, because without you guys, I simply couldn't make these videos, since I'm not funded by anyone else than my patrons. So in other words, these are the channel's heroes. The current patrons that are making these videos possible are Justin, Anna and Michael, Pyro Simba, Alexander, Luke, Laurentius, Jean, Milan, and lastly William. A huge thanks to all of you. You are genuinely amazing.